And we're back.
Welcome to episode 170 of No Direction, the Pathfinder News, Reviews, and Interviews podcast. I'm Ryan Costello.
And I'm Jefferson J. Thacker, also known as Parham.
It is 2018?
2018!
All right. Funny enough, I'm already getting used to it. It's like 2017 is a distant memory.
As well it should be.
Well, we are back after a brief holiday hiatus, and we are ready to talk Pathfinder, to talk about our home games. And we had a fun topic come up in the Discord chat, or at least it was inspired by something that was going on in the Discord chat, where largely Lone Dwarf, Dr. Wu, and Luthern were talking about some of the past Pathfinder hardcovers, specifically Ultimate Combat. And it reminded me that it's like, I remember really getting excited for Ultimate Combat when it came out, and I cannot think of any options I've actually used from Ultimate Combat. So I thought we would start a new year by looking back and seeing how our thoughts have changed about some of the hardcovers that have come out in the past. Now, we're not going to cover 2017, but 2017 is actually, it highlights exactly how this works, because when we reviewed Bestiary 6, I said this was a book I love that I don't see myself using that much. And then we reviewed The Adventurer's Guide, and that was a book that it's like has very obvious problems, and yet I see myself getting a lot of use out of this book. So what's the difference between our impressions when we review a book and when we've actually practically used it? How do those impressions change?
Oh, goodness. And in some of these books, they have definitely changed. Just doing some little mental math when you talked about this feature earlier today, I was just like, wait, I can think of a couple of books where that has swung massively in different directions.
Is one of those books the core rulebook?
Absolutely not. All right, so honestly, the core rulebook came out swinging, and it's still the book that probably gets the most use at any given table any given day, because if no other reason, it's got most of the spells in it that still get commonly used on any printed project, and as well as the basic classes that are still the most popular classes, even if some of them have been updated through the years.
Yeah, if I come up with a new character concept, I will start with one of the core rulebook classes most of the time. And even if then I branch out from there and see like, well, if it's like that, could it also be more like if it's like a fighter, is it more like a slayer? And then I'd have to look at them both closely. But it's just so, it's core. It's what makes Pathfinder Pathfinder. And arguably another book, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's definitely, there's so many starting points there that even if you've got, multiple archetypes, feat trees from 1,000 books, spells from all over the place, odds are you've got at least a couple of familiar favorites from the core rulebook on your character.
Yeah. And when they start talking about I don't usually subscribe to this method of thought, but when they start tiering the classes and saying which classes are more popular than others, or which classes are more powerful than others, some of the most powerful classes are still just straight from the core rulebook. That's where your druid and your wizard and your cleric live at.
Oh man, there's so many things I want to say about a book that came out the following year, because so much of why I think the core rulebook stayed relevant through all this time, and this was 2009. It's been a while since the core rulebook came out. But a book that came out in 2010 introduced something that allowed Paizo to find a way to refresh the original classes, and patches sometimes just reinvigorate the themes, expand on what those classes could be.
We missed a book, though. We skipped one.
All right. I know the book you're talking about, but what are your thoughts on the bonus bestiary?
The bonus bestiary I have never used. Not once.
Have I ever used it? There were a couple of, maybe not old standbys, but there were a couple of interesting creatures or surprising creatures to be included in the bonus bestiary. They've all shown up. Like every last one of them have shown up in a future bestiary hardcover. The book is just a novelty now. It was the first free RPG product, or the first Pathfinder RPG branded free RPG product, and the first Pathfinder RPG branded product, period. So it'll always have a place in my heart, and it'll always have a place in collectors' collections if they've got a place in their bank account that they don't mind voiding for it.
This is actually not even an expensive one to get. You can still pick this one up fairly cheap on the secondary market, and Paizo still has stock. So this is not
physical
one
stock?
that's hard to get. Yeah, actually, right now they're running. I think they're running out of. I think they're doing their like just a few of them left sale, and you can pick up a copy of this thing for $1.
I had no idea. I had it from that 2009 Free RPG Day product, so I assumed I had something rare and collectible in my collection.
No, if you want the rare and correct collectible Free RPG Day one, you're needing to go back 1 year to Hollow's Last Hope, which was the game mastery line, which eventually became the Pathfinder modules. That's the technically first book that has anything to do with Pathfinder. And then there's technically one other product, the little encounters index cards that came with the miniatures, is technically predates anything else that happens in Galarian.
I have one of those. It's got some kind of demon. I don't remember what it's called. I think it's like a demon, a pillar, and a caster.
Those are a neat idea, but they were a really high price point, and it's kind of easy to see why that line didn't really catch on.
What I will always remember about that line is at my first PaizoCon in a panel, someone basically pitched that idea. They were like, why don't you release encounters that have the monsters prepackaged with them? And Sean K. Reynolds was just like, it didn't sell very well. And then the guy kept pushing the idea, and he's like, we thought it was a great idea too. It wasn't.
Nope. Did not work out very well. I have them all. They were cool, and I got them because they didn't sell very well, and I bought them for about $2 a piece.
Wow. For 3 metal miniatures?
Yeah, and little map cards and the little encounter and everything. They're nice. I have not dared open them.
Oh, mine's totally open. Some of the figures are based.
Oh, no.
I know.
Now, almost all of those figures and sculpts have since appeared as pre-painted plastics in the WizKids line, so there's no big rush to go hunt those down unless you really want them for collector's sake.
Right, and if it didn't get carried over, it probably just wasn't that good of an idea. Kind of like the line itself, apparently.
And then came Bestiary.
Yes, technically not Bestiary 1, and boy, my fondest memory of Bestiary is just how frustrating it was trying to order this book, and the guy at the gaming store kept calling it the Bestiary. And I'm like, I am sure you are typing it in with an A where there shouldn't be an A, and that's why you're not finding anything. And he just was not getting that it was the Bestiary, not Bestiary.
Oh, goodness.
Did I say my fondest memory? My most vivid memory.
And I love the Bestiary for one simple reason.
Go on.
Well, it was at the time before this, remember, Pathfinder was really just propping up 3.5. It would eventually become its own beastie. But at this point in time, a lot of us were still using a whole lot of 3.5 material. You had to. You didn't even have Monster Book yet. And Pathfinder was just sort of replacing the core rulebooks. And the Bestiary was the monster manual with the right stat block format. Because about halfway through 3.5, they introduced the new stat block format, but never went back and errated their old publications to match the new format. And so you had to constantly flip back and forth between which stat block format your monsters were in when you were using old 3.5 material. And then they updated it to the Bestiary. Everything was in the new format. It had all this really cool Paizo art based off Wayne Reynolds' concept designs. And it was great. But it was still just your monster manual. It wasn't nothing special about this. I mean, some of the universal monster rules and stuff like that Pathfinder introduced, and those, of course, that's when they started using the little icons for the various elements in the monster type. That makes them a little bit easier to flip through. But it's still just, at the Bestiary 1 time, you're still just dealing with their version of the core 3 books from D&D.
One thing I will say, though, is that they don't feel like nearly 10-year-old books. Like, they're chock full of art, which is not something that Paizo had to rev up to. They reused a lot of art from the Pathfinder Chronicles and Pathfinder. Was it always the Adventure Path line? It was just called Pathfinder,
There was
right?
the Pathfinder Adventure Path line. It was always called the Adventure Path line.
Oh, okay.
Then there was the Chronicles, which were their campaign setting style books. And also, a lot of this art came from the module line, the Game Mastery module line, which were their standalone adventures. A lot of the art in the core rulebook came from that too.
So art-wise, the Pathfinder art has evolved somewhat, but it's still very much what was established in 2009. And a lot of the formats, like the Bestiary format, hasn't really changed. In fact, it might not have changed at all. I know that equipment format has changed after Ultimate Equipment, but for the most part, you pick up the core rulebook and it doesn't feel wrong or outdated or awkward. It's still, this is the template, and they got so many of these templates right.
The art style has, the layout style has evolved after about the strategy guide, which we're going to go into when we get about that far. But you're right, the amount of art and the dedication to full color, full spread layouts was something that they kind of pioneered in the industry. And a lot of the industry has basically been playing catch up to Paizo's art direction for years.
Now, you mentioned that they were recreating the core 3 rulebooks, like copying the core 3 that Dungeons & Dragons has always done, which is the Player's Handbook. I almost called it the core rulebook because it's been that long since I thought about the core rulebooks for Dungeons & Dragons. So yeah, it was the Player's Handbook, the the Dungeon Master Guide, and the Monster Manual. And those books were basically covered with those 2 books because the core rulebook is double-sized and includes most of the information that was in the Dungeon Master Guide. So in 2010, when the Game Mastery Guide came out, there's a lot. That was actually the first book with a lot of original content, like not updated and adapted content. It is mostly original content.
And really, their Game Mastery Guide was what would usually be in a D&D line, their Dungeon Master Guide 2. Where it was basically a lot of advice and subsystem rules and on how to run the game. And this was not a very crunchy book, except for one very special chapter, which has gone on to basically reshape the entire game. In that it had this section of NPCs in that chapter, and that made it also a tiny little bestiary. And what a lot of people don't remember before the NPC guide and the Game Master Guide's NPC section changed the game a bit is that for a lot of Pathfinder and in D&D 3.5 adventures, when you're wanting to go up against humanoid opponents, unless you're wanting to go up against Warrior 1 version straight out of the stat block, you basically had to do a lot of work as a GM to just stat up these things with new classes, equip them, get them ready. And that was a lot of work. If you were going to go up against a drow campaign or an orc campaign, then you had to spend a significant chunk of your time creating like 5 or 6 different variations on these basic same monsters just to keep the encounters interesting and to, you know, just make logical sense. This is what their warriors are going to look like. They're going to, of course, need some ranged characters. They're probably going to have some sneaky dudes. They're probably going to have some specialist dudes. We definitely need a bunch of casters. We're going to need the big boss person. All of that was going to need to be covered and created, and that was on the GM's back to do it. When they had the Game Mastery Guide, it came out with this chapter of just pre-generated stat blocks. Almost all of them were human, unfortunately, but that was used a ton in my games up until the book that replaced the need for that. So even though I read through the advice section of the Game Mastery Guide, and it's filled with really good advice for brand new GMs, it's not a book I was going to go back to, because you're only going to read an advice book once or twice, and then you've read the advice, you know what it says. It's not exactly something you're going to pull for table reference, except for that chapter. And then because of that chapter, that book stayed in my travel bag constantly until it was replaced with the NPC guide later.
Now, you're saying that was mostly an advice book, and I do remember a lot of advice on it. I especially liked the plotting breakdown, where it's like the different flow charts and shows this is how you can tell a story, and this is how you can tell a story that you don't have full control over. That was really smartly laid out and well written. But I think you might be underestimating just how much crunch is in there. This is where the chase rules were first. Well, anyway, maybe they were first in the Adventure Path line, but they were given a wider audience here. I don't like them, but, you know, I've never liked them, so that's not an opinion that's changed. Disasters and planar adventures are sections that were not really given much time in the core rulebook. Drugs and sanity are two areas that were first covered in the Game Mastery Guide and probably what I reference the most now. So even after the NPC guide has come out, these two sections are still the basis. Actually, maybe not sanity anymore now that Horror Adventures has come out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember. Did Horror Adventures
you're also
supplement
forgetting
it
something
or supplant it?
You're also forgetting another subsystem that was covered in here that you hate. The haunt rules.
Now, I don't hate haunts like I hate chases, but haunts bug the heck out of me. Mostly that this is how I think traps should be handled, except that narratively they should make sense and should have more player interaction. Haunts, it's like, here's an elaborate backstory that you have no way of knowing. Here's how you handle the haunt if you're not a cleric that you have no way of figuring out. It's a cleric-specific version of traps when rogues already need there to be traps to justify their place in the four pillars of base classes. All right, maybe I gave haunts more of a rundown than chases, but that's because I can explain why I don't like haunts and because I want haunts to be better. Whereas chases, it's just like, this doesn't work. The DCs don't make sense. They're inconsistent. The chase cards don't help at all. I think this is my go-to example just because it's one of the first chases I ever did after I got the chase deck, where it was like, you play the first card, it's a shortcut, and the DCs were too high for either of my players, or for any of my players. Sorry, both of the DCs on there were too high for any of the players to overcome this first obstacle, and they were like, it's the shortcut. Can't we just take the way? It's like, apparently not, because chase cards are very specific to how they're supposed to be laid out and how you're supposed to overcome challenges. You can skip it, but it's even harder to skip it. And it doesn't make any sense from the perspective of the eyes of the player characters. If this is a role-playing game, everything has to make sense from the point of view of the roles that are being played. And chase cards do not.
Nope. And what's worse is the chase system gets used constantly in printed material. There was a second system that could have replaced it. I don't even remember what book it's in, but I did not enjoy the
it.
pursuit system from
yes, Ultimate Intrigue.
Yes,
yeah, and it was just the same thing. Like, it was their chance to fix it. All right, Param, can you take over? We've got our Scarlet cameo. Oh, this is the book I've been most excited to talk about. Why don't you tell people why I was excited to talk about the APG?
All right, so up until now, in the history of Pathfinder, Pathfinder was basically just their homebrewed version of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 with incredible art and well-edited rules, and of course some really fun systems such as sorcerers getting bloodlines, which we take for granted right now. But before that, sorcerers were just really boring people that just did the one type of casting. They were just the spontaneous wizards with less spells. And now they have their whole identity in options, and they took that concept of the sorcerer bloodline, which is one they constantly reference when they said their inspiration for what was going to come next, and they created in the Advanced Player's Guide the Archetypes. The Advanced Player's Guide may not have headlined the Archetypes. It basically introduced 6 new classes to Pathfinder, and I'm always going to get this wrong, but it's the Witch, the Alchemist, the Summoner, the Cavalier. No, is the Cavalier here? Yeah, the Cavalier, the Inquisitor, and I'm always getting these wrong. Anyway, and then they introduced the Archetype system, which was basically what prestige classes were trying to be all these years. Okay, so it's the Cavalier, the Alchemist, the Inquisitor, the Oracle, the Summoner, and the Witch. Those are the 6 base classes that were introduced in Advanced Player's Guide. For the Archetypes, what it meant was that in Pathfinder you could trade out class features for any given class to get a whole new set of themed class features. You could just basically shape how your class played from the beginning, and it was fantastic concept. It was more exciting to us at the time than any of the 6 classes they introduced, which are still some of the strongest classes thematically in the game. Witches are still one of the go-to favorites of Pathfinder. And before Pathfinder really defined the witch, which was a common class you would see in various versions of D&D as examples of custom classes or thrown together classes, but never had their own identity for something that should be just such a core part of fantasy. Not to mention the Summoner, which basically upended a lot of the game balance-wise by introducing this super-powered custom monster carrier that eventually was one of the classes that had to be reined back in. It's the only class in Pathfinder to be revised in order to nerf it that they've ever released. You back with us, Ryan?
I am back with you. So one of the things that always fascinated me about the Advanced Player's Guide is just how kind of just scattershot the 6 classes are. So they weren't like introducing 4 new classes that represented the pillars, or they weren't like just finding like the specific gaps and filling them. It's really just, here's 6 new classes. They don't go together, but it's new and it's stuff you've never seen before, mixed with, like you said, the witch is kind of the one that it's like, why wasn't this always a solid class to begin with? Mm-hmm. And looking back, I think the Alchemist is probably the most influential one because it introduced a whole new power source. And so a lot of the most original hybrid classes that we're going to eventually talk about in the Advanced Class Guide, the most original ones are branches off of the Alchemist. Because honestly, I think the Alchemist could be its own category of classes. And I think that it also really established the level of technology you could expect in Pathfinder, because before the Alchemist, science was not a thing. It was not a thing in 3.5 D&D, and now it is. And like, it allowed for the gunslinger to, even though it's still the most controversial new base class that was introduced conceptually, it opened up. It was the first step that allowed a later level of technology than medieval. Because I don't even think of Pathfinder as medieval fantasy. I just think of it as medieval to Renaissance fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it basically is, and I don't think that was even intentional. When they were talking about Pathfinder in the early days, they were saying they didn't want to have a heavy clockwork influence. Well, that's changed over the years. And they didn't want the guns to be such a huge influence, but that's changed over the years significantly, especially in the fiction, where it is definitely a Victorian-level fantasy game, not a medieval fantasy game, at least in practice of what you see in their promotional materials and their novels, in their comic books. It's not so much traditional medieval fantasy anymore. Also, the Advanced Player's Guide just hands down defined what Pathfinder was going to be. Up until this point, Pathfinder was just a Me Too of D&D, and this is where they really showed, no, this is our vision for what this game is going to be like going forward, and this is the point that Pathfinder became its own game.
And just to complement Archetypes, because I know you summed them up very well. Archetypes, I saw originally as like I didn't like them as much as I liked alternate class features, which were introduced in 3.5. Mm-hmm. But alternate class features were really all over the place as far as balance, and they were rarely thematic. And sometimes they would just add a new element to a class, and later class features would be contradicted by the earlier element. So when Archetypes said, like, here's a series of alternate class features, they are connected with a theme, which Chat has pointed out is similar to the kits from 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. At first I was like, what if I don't want the later ones? Or what if I only want to pick and choose some? But I've definitely come to embrace the potential of having an archetype, being able to swap out multiple class features, how you can balance one swap versus another, how you can really expand on the themes and the flavor. Oh yeah, Archetypes were a game changer, and the Advanced Player's Guide should be remembered for it. It also has a very ho-hum feat section, spell section, prestige class section. Like, maybe half of that book is subpar options when compared to the core rulebook, but the new ideas and the potential that was introduced with the Advanced Player's Guide is definitely why it's remembered so fondly.
Mm-hmm. Now, after the Advanced Player's Guide became Bestiary 2, also known as the filler bestiary. This
Yeah.
was a... Now, I'm not dissing the monsters they didn't hear, but this was the obvious bestiary. This is all the stuff they took out of the monster manual that they needed to put back into the game, because the original bestiary didn't publish the monster manual one for one. There were some key swaps. This is where a whole lot of the bonus... This is where the bonus bestiary material started to get introduced back into the core line. And this was also where a lot of the monsters that were produced for the adventure paths in the back of the at the time game mastery modules were starting to be added to the game. So there was a lot of reprint material in here, and while it was a solid bestiary option, there wasn't a lot of surprises in this book. It still won. Like all the bestiaries, I still pull this off the shelf regularly, to the point that it's showing wear and tear very visibly. But I guess nothing in here really stands out compared to some of the other books.
I cannot talk about the Bestiary 2 without really talking about, without comparing it to Bestiary 3 for some reason. And so, yeah, I think my main point about why I still think of Bestiary 2 as the least of all bestiaries, I'll hold on to that when we talk about Bestiary 3.
Mm-hmm. Then the double splat combo can't hit us. This was with the ultimate word entered the playing field here, and with the ultimate magic and ultimate combat. We'll start with ultimate magic, but these are really a pair of books that hit. They were really closely tied together, released close together, and were meant to be considered as a pair. Paizo, up until this point, was saying they didn't want to do a lot of splat books. That was kind of one of the things that D&D 3.5 was doing over the years, and they wanted to step away from. So they were just going to do these two things, hit the splat book, and then we'll be done with splat books forever, right? That's not what happened. But we got Ultimate Magic and Ultimate Combat have great feat sections. Some of the best feats in the game are from these two books. They introduce the Magus, the Samurai, the Ninja, and the Gunslinger classes to the game. With the Samurai and Ninja, they're more souped up archetypes, but the Gunslinger and the Magus are definitely standalone classes, and I think the Magus is still probably one of the most used classes in the game because everybody loves their fighter wizards. They appear in a lot of the novels. They appear at a lot of PFS tables, and he's one of the classes that can compete in the Damage Olympics.
Not in the DPS Olympics, because he tends to be Nova or nothing.
Right. It's just one big hit. One big hit.
Average it out over an entire adventure. Yeah, he's up there with everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Magus I still remember fondly. It's I rolled up a Magus as soon as I got the book. It was my first Pathfinder Society character, and I don't see them as often anymore. I think since the Advanced Class Guide came out, but between the release of Ultimate Magic and the Advanced Class Guide, I definitely felt like Magus could be considered almost a 12th core as far as popularity. I think it usurped the Advanced Player's Guide classes in that regard.
It's funny that you mentioned him as the 12th core. We use him because the iconic Magus is Setiel, who was the 12th iconic in the core rulebook. They had 12 iconics, and he was supposed to be the iconic for prestige classes and multi-classing because he was the Eldritch Knight. Well, I don't see a lot of Eldritch Knights being made anymore, not since the Magus came out. And so Setiel became the iconic Magus and is indeed quite literally the 12th iconic.
There's a couple of other things in Ultimate Magic that were really selling points, or Ultimate Magic and Ultimate Combat. Ultimate Magic, a lot of work was put into Words of Power. In fact, that was one, most of the time when they did the playtest, the alpha rules for the new book, it would be the new class. For Ultimate Magic, it was the new class and Words of Power. And I don't think they ever did a subsystem playtest after that. And I know that it definitely hit the ground with a lot of buzz, but it's gotten virtually no support from later books. And it's just not something people really talk about anymore. And to a lesser extent, at least as far as buzz goes, Ultimate Combat, one of the things I was most looking forward to was the vehicle rules. Because vehicles are cool. and I was really looking forward to them. But other than kind of expanding on how ships work, that also fell by the wayside. Like it was a full subsystem that even after the book was released, when you would find that when you would find vehicles in published adventures, they would say, here's some simplified versions of the vehicle rules. If you want to use the vehicle rules from Ultimate Combat, go ahead. But it was even like Paizo was acknowledging that you didn't need anything so robust to have fun with vehicles.
Yeah. I still am hoping for simplified vehicle rules to appear someday and kind of fix that hole in the game. But at the same time, this is not a game that really needs a lot of vehicle rules because it's still a fantasy game and you need ship rules. You don't need wagon rules.
Ultimate Combat. So, like I said earlier, this is the book that people were talking about that I was like, I don't think I've ever used anything from Ultimate Combat. But it was pointed out, I believe by Luthorn, that Ultimate Combat introduced style feats. And that was a major changer for martial characters because it gave you a lot more to thrive for. Excuse me. And it also it opened up some of the stuff that was limited to magic usually, but didn't have to be. And so now you can apply a lot more conditions in combat to your opponents, which is just something that martial characters could not do.
And it's also, Jay Franklin's pointing out that this is also a lot of Asian options were appearing in these books because the Jade Regent Adventure Path was coming out. And in Bestiary 3, too, a lot of Asian monsters were appearing. And so the reason we had a samurai and a ninja and the monk was getting a whole lot of love in this book is because they needed to flesh those options out because they were going to have this big Asian campaign setting and adventure path, and that was going to be a big part of Pathfinder. And that kind of went away, too. When they first announced the Tianjia area. It was
Jade Regent.
Not the Jade Regent.
The Dragon Empires.
The Dragon Empires. It was going to be a hardcover, much like the Undersea World Guide was. Or, sorry, this was still the Pathfinder campaign setting book. The Undersea World Guide didn't exist yet. And then it got downgraded to a soft cover. And the AP was everything everybody was talking about, and they even had that really cool Dave Gross book, Master of Devils, came out, which was like really fun to explore through Tianjia like that. And then it hit, and we all were like, "This was cool," and then we never talked about Asia again.
Except for the next Bestiary that came out. Bestiary 3 was like the international creatures. It took cryptics. It took just creatures from cultures and lore that are familiar, that a lot of them were never in the 3.5 bestiaries, just for whatever reason, even though they were immediately recognizable creatures. And so my big thing about Bestiary 2 versus Bestiary 3 is that if I take out a Bestiary 1 creature, people immediately know what it is. They're familiar with it. It's like, okay, these are pillars of fantasy. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, those are the recognizable monsters that you say, like, I'm in a fantasy setting. Bestiary 2, not so much. Bestiary 2 really feels like I could bust out a Bestiary 2 creature, today, put it on the table, and have a lot of players being like, wow, what is that? I've never fought that. Because it's just, there was no theme to it. They were just a weird variety of monsters, and they just didn't get used as often. And a lot of them were harder to sum up. Some of them were just like, it's like this other creature, but now its wings are fiery. Whereas Bestiary 3, you get the same reactions when you're busting out a Bestiary 1 monster. You're like, oh, it's a Sasquatch, or it's I'm sure there's more than Sasquatches in the book, and I'm not positive the Sasquatch is in the book, Bram. The Bandersnatch and the Jabberwock were introduced in this book?
The Jabberwocky was Bestiary's 2, but this is where you got your Bandersnatch.
Yes, Bandersnatch. Place in my heart for Bandersnatch. Well, anyway, so the Bestiary 3, they were like iconic monsters. They were like destined to already implement into your game seamlessly. And that's why I loved this book right away, because I was reading through it. I would see a name and I would immediately know what my expectations were, and sometimes they were met, sometimes they were subverted, and sometimes that was a good thing and sometimes it was a bad thing. But it was definitely a lot more exciting than reading Bestiary 2, which just felt like weird monster, weird monster, weird monster, no theme to latch onto, no expectations to have.
But and that's a trend that took and just kept running with it. That has defined what a Paizo bestiary is now. It's always they're going to these far off, not far off cultures. They're going to cultures that are underrepresented in the fantasy genre and just going into whole mythologies. They go into Russian mythology. They go into South Asian mythologies. They go into South American mythologies. They go into African mythologies. And they bring these cool legends and creatures that we've all heard of and know a little bit about, and then just bring them into rich fidelity into the game and tie it in. And it works so well. And it works so well because Galarian is this humongous kitchen sink multicultural weaved in setting, so these all have a place there. So yeah, this had a heavy on the Asian influence because again this was going to support the Dragon Empires, but then you had a lot of this the South Asian stuff. You had a lot of the rest of the cultures that just were not very well represented until these books started making it. Well, of course, why hasn't people done that?
Now, I don't know if you have the same feeling as me, Param, but it feels like 2011, which we just finished talking about, and before, is like one chunk of Pathfinder history. Whereas 2012, even though, the first book here came out only a couple of months after Bestiary 3, it feels like that still feels like one of the newer releases, or like a second era of Pathfinder. Okay.
It definitely feels like
you don't have that same feeling.
I kind of feel like this is definitely a second era. I just don't feel it is very recent because at this point, a lot of these have just sort of been. Well, you start off with the Advanced Race Guide, which is where we get a massive dump of races into the game, and also the race building rules were introduced here. And I'm not a big fan of a lot of races in my fantasy games. I'm usually fine with the core. But, if you wanted to play a billion other fun races, you could get them out of here. And it also had a lot of alternate racial traits and a lot of feats and a lot of crunch in here that have sort of become kind of core. I haven't seen, after this book was released, I haven't seen a halfling yet that hasn't swapped out to get not 20 feet speed. Because why would you? And I'm going to bring that up again when we get into our reviews later today. Because a funny little bit of coincidence has happened that I will bring up later. But
go ahead.
Sorry, but it doesn't feel like it's that new anymore. It's kind of it's definitely not the initial bombardment, which was all the way up through Bestiary 3. It feels like the initial. Well, we're finished defining what our game is going to be as a base level. Once the Ultimate Combat and the Ultimate Magic came out, and then Bestiary 3 to support all of that. I kind of felt like Pathfinder was a complete game, whereas before it was always waiting for it to fill in this next hole that needed to be obviously filled in.
The Advanced Race Guide still bugs me. I like you, I don't need a whole lot of races in my game. I don't mind the occasional one, and I kind of liked how 3.5 balanced its new races better than this. It released a new... not core race, but like a new race that was going to get some support and be seen as a major playable race 3 times, or eventually more. But they had their races of books where it was 2 core classes, 2 core races, and a new race. Whereas, and all of those races I found were memorable, and at some point or another I played one of those races. Whereas the Advanced Race Guide races, it just never quite hit with me what the core races were. They were definitely not balanced. If you were playing a goblin or a kobold, you were an inferior character just because the bonuses you get were inferior. If you were playing a tiefling or an Asmar, you were a superior character because you had some really powerful spell-like abilities right from early on. And with no effort made to balance those, I think that every campaign I've run since that book has come out, I've said, you can play any race from the core rulebook. Any other race, you need special permission, and you have to justify in story why that is a really interesting character to take. Because I know which ones are more powerful and less powerful, and I need to curb my campaign based around that power level, but I'm not going to reject an idea if you really are just in love with the flavor of that race. I also really don't like the idea of these race-specific feats, because they needed to create so many options for the Advanced Race Guide that some of them were just good feats that are limited to a single one because of the book they came out. in. So, yeah, there's a lot of resentment for the advanced race guide from me.
Oh. We need to pause here right now, Ryan, because we're experiencing some technical difficulties with the stream.
I hear it from you. Did you hear it from me?
I hear what from you?
I hear the technical difficulties from you. You're a little bit of a Cylon.
Oh, yeah. Well, we will need to address it. Yeah. Hold on a minute, guys.
Okay.
And we're back, guys. Sorry, and gals. Sorry about all that. We just had a little bit of a networking hiccup, but it looks like we are back in the green, so we can continue. Okay, so after the Advanced Race Guide came out, I'm not going to mention the character folio. The less we mention about the character folio, the better. Oh!
Well, now I feel like we have to mention the character folio. You can't just take a swipe at it and walk away.
Yes, I can.
All right. I don't like it either. I think if people are looking for our impressions, I may have liked it at the time, but having used it practically takes up too much space and it's not organized.
If my memory serves, you didn't like it at the time either.
No? All right, then.
All right. Okay, we forgot an important product that came out that wasn't really a hardcover, but the beginner's box came out right before Bestiary 3 came out, and it was this nice box set that was a simple version of Pathfinder, and it was really great for its layout, and they did a lot of research on how people learn role-playing games, and still it's probably one of the best learn how to play a role-playing game standalone products that's been produced for any game ever. But it came with a product that has since changed everything. Inside the Bestiary box were these little bitty cardboard pawns made out of the same things they punched the dungeon tiles out of back in the D&D 3.5 days. These little pawns of all the monsters and player character options for playing through the beginning box. Now, all beginning box usually had some form of this, but these little pawns had these little plastic bases, and they were wonderful. And then the world demanded that Paizo make more of these because it was worth buying that little box just to get those pawns out of it. And so they did. The Bestiary box line launched. Basically their pawn line launched. And so basically from that point forward, every single monster book, all the mainline bestiaries, the NPC codexes and such that we'll talk about later, have these nice little boxed pawn sets. And also the AP line started getting their own little, not box sets, but little folios of pawns, and it made getting into the game substantially cheaper because the pawn boxes are like $45, and they come with hundreds of these pawns that you can use as miniatures, multiple copies of the ones you would think you would need multiple copies of too. And the barrier for
non-randomized.
Non-randomized. You get all the monsters from the Bestiary in this box. Well, there's some exceptions because they only go up to size huge, so anything size gargantuan or higher don't have pawns. So you're on your own for those. But for everything huge and lower, which is 90% of the game, 95% of the game, you could just get it. And that meant that you no longer had to go and collect hundreds of dollars worth of miniatures to get into a usable collection for Pathfinder. The pawn sets have been so popular that I know everybody that a lot of my 5th edition players buy the pawn sets just to get the pawns. Now eventually Wizards of the Coast did Me Too this and made their own little tokens that were produced the same way without the standees, but the pawn sets themselves have been great. And so far that even Starfinder launched with pawn sets because it was so important to have cheap miniatures available for a game. And I just can't imagine Pathfinder without pawns again.
Yeah, I don't think people even remember fully having to just substitute a monster for the next closest monster that you had a miniature for. And like, yeah, I loved pawns, and I still love pawn. And I've stopped getting the new pawn sets. I've just got, because I've got enough. Once you get NPC codex and a couple of the bestiary ones, you can do that reasonable substituting, but you just don't have to do it as much, Param. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, you shouldn't have to do it at all, because pawn sets, and I don't know that this was intentional, but the boxes are just big enough that you can put the book in the box with the pawns.
Ooh, I never noticed that.
I mentioned it every single time we talk about them.
No. All right, I believe you. I'm sorry.
All right, but moving on from that, because there's not much to say than they were awesome. The pawn set came out. Then there was Ultimate Equipment, the book that was not correctly named the month it came out. It still is one of the... It's this massive book with all the equipment options that existed up until that point in time, with a really great index where it started reorganizing the items by slot you put them in instead of what type they were, because that was always a bit of a hassle to flip through the other books to remember, well, is this technically a wondrous item, or is this an armor piece, or what is the boots of blank? And then in the Ultimate Equipment, it was just, is this a boot item? They're here. Is this a ring? They're here. And nice, well organized. And then because Player Companions came out that same month, it was obsoleted the day it came out. It's still a fantastic reference. I'm eagerly awaiting its sequel, the Ultimator Equipment. But it's a fantastic book. But other than that, it has a few rules with like equipment tricks and things like that. But mostly it's just a big catalog. It's the Sears and Roebuck catalog of Galarian.
And introduced kits based on each class, and I really appreciate those. They tend to be the first item that I will buy no matter what class I'm playing. And just otherwise, there's a fair amount of new content on there, even though it looked like it was just a compilation. And I wrote some stuff for Ultimate Equipment, so I'll always remember it fondly for that.
I still use this book every session. It just
Absolutely.
It just gets pulled off the shelf constantly. This is definitely one of the, if you're getting started, this isn't maybe your first round purchase, but it's a book that needs to get in your collection eventually if you're going to be playing Pathfinder. Just like this next book.
NPC Codex, the Bestiary of People. It took what was introduced in the Game Mastery Guide and it codified it a little more so that you got an option for every class from the core rulebook for every level. It had a lot more variety to the themes. It had a lot more variety to the races. The options were all just based out of the core rulebook, so they are not super optimal, but they are still, like, there's so much thought and care clearly put into all of the characters. Maybe not all of them, but they were going outside the box instead of just like the NPC gallery in the Game Mastery Guide hit all of the basics that you see in so many adventures, whereas the NPC Codex, there's a lot of concepts that it's like, I want to make this character, or I want to play this character. This is really creative and cool and evocative, and it's like it populated the world not just with more monsters and more adversaries, but just with more personalities.
And it did a cool, you mentioned that it had off-the-wall characters. They did a really neat system with this where they wanted to also do the classics. So for every class, every other level was one that was a very traditional version of that class that you came to expect, so that, hey, I just need a by-the-book fighter, but he needs to be about 6th level. You could go in here and grab it. And then every other one was like this off-the-wall unique thing. With this, well, this is a fighter that specializes in throwing splash weapons. You know, that sort of craziness started to happen on every other one. So you would always be at least within one level of grabbing either something more traditional or something off the wall. They also did most of a good selection of races got represented in here, so it's not just all 20 levels of human fighter. And this is a book that gets used in printed material. I believe this book only exists, well, it exists for a lot of reasons. But I think half the reason they could justify making this book is the massive amount of print cost it saved them by being able to reference these characters in printed material as opposed to printing out custom stat blocks, because that's often what you see now in PFS adventures or in AP adventures or module adventures is you have the bad guy, and he's got his unique stat blocks, and he has 4 goons with him. See NPC codex page something 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 rogue goon level 6, and that way they were able to just easily fill out the Mook roster without having to dedicate so much time developing unique stats for all of them.
It also means that, because you never know when a PC is going to pick a fight, and so the book might just contain a character that his entire stat block is bracket fighter 7 closed bracket, and it's like, I have nothing else there. He's just the guy who works at the bar, and I don't know why this PC's in his face, but we're rolling for initiative, and I need a stat block really quickly. So usually now it'll be like, use the stats from this for a character that wouldn't have got any stats before.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a book that was only possible because the pawns were so successful, and so it justified the high art budget that this book needed. Like, there is a lot of characters that, like, it's not reusable art because it's so specific to that character. The pawns allowed Paizo to use another art and, like, make more, like, art costs go down the more times you can sell the same piece of art. And so the NPC Codex turning into the NPC Codex pawn set probably is the only reason they could justify the art cost of the NPC Codex.
Yeah. And then the NPC Pawn Box came out, and that was, besides the fact that it was all of these critters, it's a nice box full of just random looking humanoids that you can add to your table, because that's super important.
Now, there is one downside to the NPC Codex, and it was kind of the counter to the point you were making, and that is that because they can save on word counts in published adventures by not putting up stat blocks, it's kind of thrown off the page to time at the table ratio. And so a lot of adventures, especially Pathfinder Society scenarios, started taking a lot longer to run because they had a lot more word count to accommodate for other things. So more encounters, more just non-encounter options that kind of, like, they make better adventures, but it just makes it hard to estimate how long a session will go.
And also, over-reliance on this book eventually led to the rule for Pathfinder Society that the stat blocks for all the things had to be printed in the back appendix. So that works fine for Society, where they don't actually have to print the pages, and it's just copying and pasting from material they've already developed. That doesn't happen in APs, but it got so bad for a while with all the cross-referencing with all the material Paizo was producing that you had like 6, 7, 8 books you needed to bring with you to properly, quote-unquote, run an adventure path. And yes, you could use digital options that were becoming more and more stable at this time, such as iPads and the PRD and apps that were being developed, but you know, at the time especially, they had to assume that a decent chunk of their players were still doing this with dead trees.
In 2013, we got an interesting selection of books because we did not get a splat book in the traditional sense. First, we got Ultimate Campaign, which was the first GM-focused book in a long time, you know, not counting Bestiaries in the NPC Codex. Mm-hmm. And that kind of, it was a surprise because when the game first came out, in one of our earliest interviews, I believe either Jason Bullman or Eric Mona said that the idea is to have a GM-focused book every year, a player-focused book every year, and a monster book every year. And by 2011, their third year, they had broken that rule. So we really didn't know when to expect the next GM-focused book. But Ultimate Campaign took a lot of the subsystems that we'd seen in the adventure paths up to this point, fixed them. Because unfortunately, the why do I keep saying advanced? The adventure path subsystems tend to have a reputation for needing a tweaking after they got published. So this was an opportunity to tweak some of those, especially kingdom building. And also just added a lot of nice essays clarifying a lot of specific rules. So unlike Game Mastery Guide, which the essays were about how to be a game master, the Ultimate Campaign essays were, here is a rule that often trips people up. Here is 2 pages of thoughts and explaining it.
Yeah, the whole section where they started breaking down like magic and why they don't really cancel out the world the way you think they do was really helpful. There was a whole section on building communities and how they should be put together. A lot of good advice sections in this book. And also, I guess the big feature of this book that was kind of unique to it, that sort of tied into kingdom building, was the Downtime system, which is sort of the subsystem that's the through line through the entire book. And it was their first attempt to sort of make codified rules for how to play a game of Pathfinder that focused rules-wise on things other than the combat and the skill challenges being just like one-off skill rolls and then moving on. And that's basically when you started seeing like meta rules for running businesses and acquiring resources and favors. And a lot of that did tie in with the kingdom building rules, but they fleshed those out and made them their own subsystems that didn't require you to be running a kingdom to take advantage of.
What are your thoughts on Ultimate Campaign?
I still use good chunks of it, but I think I'm alone on that because I run a lot of campaigns and systems that games that aren't always super combat focused. The Downtime rules have been helpful and still continue to be helpful to just sort of keep track of that sort of stuff. And the kingdom building rules got codified here, so anytime we need to do any of that, it's nice to come here. And then I kind of just leave the book and move on. The combat rules, that was also from the Kingmaker.
Social combat?
No. The
combat. The mass combat
rules is still something like a bitter pill to me because it's simplified to too simplified. I kind of wish we could revisit that and make a better system someday. But I guess it just doesn't matter. I don't think that's a focus for Pathfinder, and this kind of like exposed that because this led into, this is something that got used a whole lot in the Wrath of the Righteous adventure path that came up later.
Oh, we're going to talk about that in a second, but I would call Ultimate Campaign my second least used book on my shelf, I think. I referenced the Game Mastery Guide more than the Ultimate Campaign, just because the subsystems are very campaign specific. You're either using them or you're not. And the advice is good, but I haven't gone back to the advice in a long time. And Downtime, actually, I just didn't find it worked. In fact, we did a Private Sanctuary breaking down the numbers on it, and it just was like, it's not what I want it to be. It was way too many rolls in way too short amount of time, and it didn't work for me, and that's too bad because I loved the idea of running businesses on the side and everything that it promised. I just didn't like the way they actually incorporated it. Now, my least used book on my shelf is Mythic Adventures, the other book that came out in 2013. I have not used it. I was going to say period, but I forgot there was the Bestiary in the back with Mythic Monsters. So other than Mythic Monsters, I have not used this book at all, and I don't think I'm alone since there's never been a book like it since.
Oh, Bard Wannabe points out something from Ultimate Campaign that has kind of stuck around. Retraining was introduced in Ultimate Campaign, and
that's true.
That has become a staple of Pathfinder going forward. So there needed to be a system like that in any game. I think in every game needs to consider characters redefining themselves at a later time. And so it was a super important part of the game. I guess that's the only
Mythic
thing
Adventures.
I used besides Downtime. Oh yeah, Mythic Adventures was a book that I loved when we were reviewing it. The sales pitch really hit me because I was like, fantasy superheroes? Oh heck yeah, let's sign up, let's do this. And I loved how reading the book, and I loved their sales pitch, and I loved some of the one-off stuff I ran as demos and tests for it. And I got our group. We just finished up Rise of the Rune Lords, and we headed head first in the Wrath of the Righteous. And oh my goodness, did my opinion of Mythic rules change after that. It is still great for monsters. It is still great for big old bad guys and stuff. Using those Mythic monsters are something I still do to this day. Man, I'm never going to let my players be Mythic again.
Yeah. Unlike you, the sales pitch did not work for me. I just kept scratching my head being like, but they already are basically superheroes. And it was like, there was some confusion because it was not epic. But before it came out, people were constantly saying, when are we getting epic Pathfinder? When are we getting level 21 plus for Pathfinder? And especially because the epic rules were in the PRD? No, PRD is the Pathfinder one.
SRD.
The SRD, yeah. So the epic rules from 3.0 were open. So if Paizo wanted to, they could have done what they did for Core Rulebook and Bestiary and just recreate those rules. But they said, often, we don't want them. We don't like those rules. We would find our own way of doing high level or high power level books. And that's what Mythic Adventures was. But that message had to be repeated and repeated. And I still think some people would have just been happier with level 21 on. And I would have been happier with a system that integrates better with non-mythic characters. I don't like the idea that you have to be mythic, like the whole party has to be mythic, and maybe even the whole world has to be mythic for mythic to really be useful. And my example was, if somebody wants to play Thor and somebody wants to play Hawkeye, I wish there was some way of saying, like, here's someone that's got something that's comparable to Thor, and yes, he will be more powerful, but he's not so much powerful that somebody who just wants to be an archer can't just be an archer.
And where Mythic broke down wasn't even in the sales pitch or the delivery. It was simply the fact that it was weighted way too heavily on increasing characters' offensive potential and increasing their action economy, which is already a very delicate thing to touch in D20 based games, and very little in defense got added. And if you wanted defensive options, it usually meant giving up offensive options, which is something players are not want to do, even in most circumstances. The D20 usually punishes that decision throughout most of its life. So Mythic Adventures became known as Rocket Tag. Yeah, the first person who wins initiative is the person who wins the fight. In my Wrath of the Righteous game, it was, if the monsters they were facing were not significantly levels of Mythic, they were no threat whatsoever. Like, I might as well not even be rolling. I don't care how many challenge ratings above the party I got. It did not matter. They just stomped every encounter. Or when I finally did get some Mythic encounters or some sufficiently high level abilities on the field to threaten them, it crushed them. There was no middle point. It was balancing everything on a razor's edge.
The Mythic Adventure at least introduced mythic monsters, and that allowed interesting solo combat. Because it meant that you can have a single creature take multiple turns or get multiple actions on its turn. And that just made certain, like, boss fights just became so much of a pile on that you really needed a really dynamic monster for them to feel any different. Whereas Mythic Adventures just did a couple of tweaks where you can slap a couple of mythic levels onto a creature, and it completely changed how single creature combat can work. It made them work interestingly. And that's kind of what Bestiary 4 was all about. It was sold as, this is the one with the big challenges. It's got the high AC armor monsters, and it's got the mythic monsters in it.
This is also where, you mentioned that, this is where, at the time, we have to remember that Paizo's competition was a game called Dungeons & Dragons 4th Edition. This is one of the first books that starts to bring in some of the good ideas from 4th edition. So the idea of their elite monsters that basically you could put this template on the monster and it became a boss monster. Is kind of what happens when you put the mythic templates on the monsters to give them the extra hit points, the extra actions, the extra survivability, so that they can, compete against the party. And that's exactly why they existed in 4th edition like that too. And that's, we start to see Paizo taking some of the good ideas from some of the games that shall not be named.
You just named it.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So even though I didn't appreciate the PCs can be superhero PCs tagline of Mythic Adventures, I loved the idea of you can have supervillains and super monsters tagline of Bestiary 4. Did Bestiary 4 introduce the kaiju?
Oh, I don't know if Bestiary 4 introduced the kaiju.
Might have been Bestiary 5. In any case, if it didn't introduce kaiju, it definitely had Cthulhu in there, and it had just so many high-level monsters, and high-level monster abilities are just fun to read. So even if I'm reading the book and it's like, my PCs are never going to fight this CR30 monster, but if they did, and just the glee over reading what those monsters could do to the PCs. Now, this isn't the only high-level monster book, Bestiary, but at the time, it definitely was. And it's probably a better balance of really high-level or really powerful, but still reasonably achievable in a game.
We do have confirmation in chat from Scott Melview that yes, kaiju were introduced in Bestiary 4.
That's what I thought.
Man, it's great when your adventure location and your monster can be the same thing. Some more Bestiary boxes got released, and then the Advanced Class Guide came out, also known as the Pathfinder Adventure Path Advanced Class Guide.
Yes, which is, it just set a bad tone for that book. It just kind of showed this book was a little bit rushed and definitely needed some polishing. It also, like, even later that year, Eric Mona was saying he wished they hadn't introduced that many new classes. And the game was very stingy about introducing new classes. It had been 3 years since a new class had been introduced. And in that time, like those 3 years ago, they'd only introduced really 2 base classes. If, like me, you consider the ninja and the samurai more of an archetype than a base class. They're still the only alternate classes. Oh, no, plus the anti-paladin. That's just kind of a concept that's never really took off. So Advanced Class Guide introduced a whole slew of new classes. And at the time, it was hard to define exactly what some of them were, why they were different, like to justify some of their existence. But first of all, some of the ones that are a little more boring thematically, like the Hunter, the Slayer, and the Arcanist, are actually pretty fun mechanically. And then some of the ones that are more defined by their flavor, like the Swashbuckler, the Inquisitor, the Investigator, they like justify their existence, and they've got some really interesting archetypes and some of the better support. And then there's a couple of gonzo classes like the Blood Rager and the Scald that just kind of they sell themselves, and they are classes that are a little too weird to have existed if they were still only releasing a couple of classes every few years. It took a book like the Advanced Class Guide to introduce and justify those classes. And I'm actually happier now that they exist. I think the Advanced Class Guide might be the book that I've turned around the most, my opinion on it.
Yeah, this is the book that had the roughest landing. We cannot express adequately the amount of typos, design mistakes, and just errors in layout and editing that was involved in this book. The book that originally came is functionally useless as a piece of paper because so much of the book had to be errated before if you have one that has the Adventure Path label on the front of it, it's a fun book to own. Don't use it. You download the updated PDF that has the errata incorporated in it now that it has had a reprint. There's a soft cover version of it out. Use those, but don't use the original book because, like, some of the things like the Captain America build for the Brawler just does not work as written.
Well, not only does it not have shield proficiency, it's an archetype that gives up the shield proficiency that the base version of the class had.
Yeah, it just does
Or
not.
the iconic Skald has no proficiency in horn instruments. Meanwhile, his iconic art is the Skald holding a horn. It's like just so much would have been caught with a second round of or not a second, but another round of edits. But this was a Gen Con release. Gen Con schedules are tight, and
this,
I don't know exactly what the reason for this
was. This was the book that that basically the strategy guide was coming out, and this is the book that suffered. This is the first time we get an example of what happens when Paizo tries to overextend itself in production schedule. We get some weird editing books hit. This happens again in their history recently. Not as bad as this. This is the worst it's ever hit. Now, to be fair, now that it's been edited, this book has had a massive impact on the game. Blood Ragers are probably one of the most popular classes on scene right now. All the other classes are very well thought out. They contribute greatly to the game. I'm glad this book exists. We just like to make fun of how rough the landing was.
Yeah, it is like, I really was worried about what impact this would have on Pathfinder as a game, with suddenly almost doubling the number of base classes in it. And yet, just a couple of years later, I can't imagine the game without a lot of those base classes.
Yep. Then we got the Monster Codex, which surprised us when it was announced, because we were expecting an NPC Codex too. But then we got the Monster Codex, which was the NPC Codex, but for orcs.
And vampires, liches, not liches. Was there liches? No. Doesn't make any sense. So, anyway, I loved the Monster Codex when it first came out.
I loved it. I still love it. It's a great book. It's basically, remember what I talked about when I said what happens when you need to make a whole bunch of orcs? Well, the NPC Codex doesn't help you, even though it exists, because they're all player races. When you actually needed orc tribes, you still had to go back, or you had to just file the serial number off the human ones and give them some of their racial abilities, which is what I did a lot. This took 20 different monster races, some of the most common ones, and gave you a whole slew of statted out versions of them, for like of them with class levels and cool builds and abilities, and just different versions of them, so that you could have whole campaigns or whole adventures using that monster without having to build up a dozen different stat blocks. And they hit a whole range of CRs. Whole range of CRs.
I think before the Monster Codex came out, one of the books that people were constantly pushing for was an evil book. So not just the evil campaign setting, but a hardcover for evil options. Monster Codex kind of does that. And does it extremely well. It's the feats and the spells are fun, and they're cruel and a little demented, and that's what's great about them, is that you will not find these options in any other book, and there's a reason that they should probably be kept out of players' hands for the most part. But man, do they make for memorable encounters or just a fun read. I don't know how many of these options I've actually used at my table, but I would still recommend the Monster Codex to most new GMs when they're considering bestiaries. I probably would say get Bestiary 1, 3, Monster Codex, and then you can look at what are the other ones. Oh, and NPC Codex. Yeah, get NPC Codex before Monster Codex. Or do you?
You do.
Yeah, you do.
Next came the strategy guide.
Finally.
The book we had a hard time ever defining why it existed.
Well, so did Paizo, because internally there was a struggle between the people that wanted this to be the step after the bestiary, after the beginner box, but before the core rulebook, or like a supplement to the core rulebook. So people that are brand new to role-playing games at all, and the people that wanted it to be another version of the Advanced Player's Guide, but like more like the player version of the Game Mastery Guide. So like a strategy game. Literally, the title is Strategy Guide, and that's what it feels like. It feels like the book that tells you how to be better at crafting characters and playing the game. It is definitely more the prior, even though the title sounds a lot more like the latter. And this was just one of those books. It was delayed because the champion for this book left the company soon after, and so there was a lot of internal restructuring at the company, and this was just a book that was like nobody knew what to do with it. Oh no, wait, I might be mixing this up with the Inner Sea Races.
We don't know. We don't know. It's hard for us to speculate.
And this is based on interviews, though.
Okay.
Yeah, this isn't like rumor or conjecture. This is poorly remembered interviews from several years of doing this podcast. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the first part is definitely right, that there was an internal struggle of Paizo wasn't even sure what they wanted this book to be.
And this thing got delayed.
I still think...
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
This thing got delayed so many times, we were wondering on air openly, has this been canceled yet?
And the answer was no.
No.
It was no. So yeah, it was originally scheduled for like a March 2014 release, and it came out later than March 2015. So it was delayed for more than a year.
Mm-hmm. And when it came out, it was a very useful little book. It definitely helped explain the concepts of the role-playing game to a new player wanting to build characters better than the core rulebook did. In a lot of ways, I think that this should have been, like in a future version of Pathfinder, theoretically, this might... A lot of the lessons we see here are what they'd use in Starfinder on how they explain the game. And how they present the game. And I think that in a future version of Pathfinder, should one exist, this will be what they use as a basis for how they introduce the concepts of the game and the classes and the options available. And it was so useful, I wish I could just give this to every new player that joined my tables, but it was also a $30 hardback on the that was an additional cost on top of a $50 hardback book. The pocket guides didn't exist at the time, and that's a really hard sell of like, here's another $30 on top of the $50 you need to invest in this game that will teach. This is the guidebook on how to read that other $50 book. It's still good, but oh my gosh, who's going to do that doesn't know that?
This was the first book that I didn't know if I was going to pick up. I probably should have also questioned Mythic Adventures, but I guess at the time, for whatever reason, I was a little more on board. Whereas Strategy Guide, it was like, I get what it's for. I don't see myself using it. And I have turned around on that. I have actually lent it out to several new players. It really does an excellent job of explaining what Pathfinder is, what role-playing is, and things that I might take for granted, like concepts. It explains them, and it's really good at anticipating the questions a new player has and answering them extremely clearly. It is the perfectly put together version of that book. Mm-hmm. And I still think there's room somewhere in the Pathfinder library for the other version of the strategy guide, not an optimization guide, but just like here's how to get a little bit more out of the options out there and how to just manage and balance all the material that's out there for Pathfinder now.
Mm-hmm. But we'll never see that version of the book. Never. I think we'll see a new version of the game long before we see it. They'll be able to justify that version of the book, especially given the tumultuous development period of this version.
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Even if Strategy Guide ended up being a good seller, and I don't know at all. I don't have an insight on that. It's just probably still leaves a bad taste in Paizo's mouth.
Next up, Unchained. Pathfinder Unchained.
Is that next up? Yeah. I have a different order.
I have it as...
No, you're right.
Yep.
Okay.
So, boy, Pathfinder Unchained was an interesting selling pitch. It's basically... there was a book that got released just about for every version of Dungeons & Dragons called Unearthed Arcana, this is a whole bunch of alternate rules that you can introduce to your game to change it up, to customize it, to do things differently, thought out from some of the developers, oftentimes some of their house rules and stuff. And that's, on the surface, really what Unchained was, and what Unchained turned out to be. There was the stamina rules, there was the skill unlock rules, there was oh gosh, man, there's so many alternate systems in this book. It's kind of hard to name them all. But
there's that monster creation system you love.
Oh my gosh, yes, the best version of monster creation that should have replaced monster creation in Pathfinder and does replace monster creation for Starfinder.
I don't know if I've ever really said that. I disagree with you on this. I actually am not that jazzed with the monster creation system, but I like the way the old way works. I like just the way monster creation, the way monster rules fit together better when they're made in the old way. Whereas I think Pathfinder Unchained is a nice, efficient way for you to throw something together if you have an idea and you need it for tonight, but not for a final published monster.
I think that a good designer that's going to make monsters worth publishing don't need the crutch of the old system to make their monsters good.
Well, anyway, we're not reviewing a Pathfinder Unchained right now, but just
no.
I knew you were going to compliment it, and it's like I think it's about time Param knows that this is not the podcast of feeling about that particular subsystem.
No, there's not. It's not even the I get disagreement on the other podcast too, on it, on my opinions there too. Especially since this is another thing that was just this is how 4th edition does it, and it's great. And it's one of the things they should have I'm like glad they stole. It's unfair to say that but either way. But most
at this
most
point,
known,
they've got Logan Bonner and Stephen Radley McFarlane on the Pathfinder design team. So 2 people who were major players in the 4th edition design have now started working for Paizo.
But most notably for Unchained is the Unchained classes that basically replace. And this is the first time this has happened because these were not. This ended up not just being optional. Technically, they're still optional if you're playing home games, but these basically replaced the classes that exist in the game. So we have a brand new Barbarian, Monk, Rogue, and Summoner. And for 2 different reasons. For the very first 3, it is to make better versions of those classes using the lessons they've learned in the game over the years of publishing. And these were the classes that most needed updating in the world of Pathfinder that they were participating in. In the case of the Rogue and the Monk, it's because those were considered 2 of the most underpowered classes in the game at the time. And they were very difficult to build efficient builds, even though you could, if you knew the system very well, build good builds for them. The barrier for entry on building characters that could compete with other characters built off the core options the other classes was much higher. So this brought them in line. The Rogue got dex to damage. It's got these cool skill systems. It got this debuffs they could put down on the sneak attacks. And the Rogue just became a better version of the Rogue, fulfilled the class fantasy, and had a lot of the headaches of running a 3rd edition era Rogue taken off of it. The Monk became the full base attack bonus wonder it was meant to be. And the Barbarian...
Well, and also incorporated the King Gong archetype into the base Monk. It's just the idea that if you want to be a little bit mystical, that's a Monk thing too now.
Yep. And then the Barbarian was mostly to make the math, and the Barbarian was already a pretty powerful class. It was just a very complicated class to run because you had 2 versions of your stats that affected each other that you had to constantly keep track of, and funny things happened when you lost temporary hit points and came out of a rage.
Yes, hilarious dead barbarians.
Hilarious dead barbarians. So they just made the Barbarian, cleaned it up, made it easier to run a Barbarian, and it's a much smoother, easier to run class. Good job. For those first 3, there's no reason you would not want to use these versions of the classes. For the Monks, some of the archetypes aren't technically compatible, so if you're wanting to run some of those advanced Monk archetypes, you might want to go back to the old version. And you're free to do so, even in Pathfinder Society. You are free to go back to the old versions of the class, but you are also free to use the new versions of the class, and you should, unless there's a very specific reason you're not wanting to, like you want to be the bow monk. I mean, you could do that. That doesn't really work very well with the new monk. The Summoner, on the other hand, was a nerf. There's no way around it. The Summoner had gone out of hand throughout its years. It was a very complicated class. It could flood the field with creatures, and it could make some very broken builds by using the customized evolutions. And so they made an easier to run Summoner. It does have the advantage that it is easier to build the Summoner now because the options got limited and more structured, and definitely a nerfed Summoner. where the options are not anywhere near as powerful as they used to be. And you could tell that it was a nerf because you can still play the old barbarian, monk, and rogue if you want to in Pathfinder Society. You are not allowed to play an old summoner. You have to play the new one.
I actually haven't played any of the Unchained classes yet. I have nothing against them. Barbarian is a class I've played a lot. Rogue is a class I've played a lot. Monk's a class I've played a lot. And yet, I just haven't played the Unchained versions. I'm really not as familiar with them as I should be. I've designed archetypes for all three of them, and I've never played them.
I have seen rogues especially. Unchained rogues are probably the one that gets used the most because the rogue needed the most love of all of them. Because Ultimate Combat saved the monk, and it didn't save the rogue. And the rogue's much easier to run now. So I've seen a bunch of Unchained rogues in both Society and in my home games. And in my Reign of Winter game, one of our new players is playing a Unchained rogue. The Unchained Barbarian I have seen a couple of times. I just don't have a lot of monk players, so I don't see a lot of that one. And I've only seen 2 Unchained Summoners. Though I very much like our Unchained Summoners in our PFS group and his pet big old nasty snake Danger Noodle.
Next up, we have one of the books that surprises the most, was Occult Adventures. And it felt like it was introducing a book dedicated to something that we've already had peppered throughout Pathfinder pretty well. Paizo loves its creepy, and it wasn't hard to find creepy options if you just wanted a creepy character. Plus, like Mythic Adventures, people were always harping on them for a psychic or a psionics book. Because, again, psionics were in the PRD, so if they wanted, they could have just made the 3.5 version of psionics for Pathfinder. Dreamscarred Press had already done that, and Dreamscarred Press, I would say, is still pretty respected for people that want psionics, although Occult Adventures did take a lot of the steam out of them. But just what was surprising about Occult Adventures is just how good everything is in that book.
Yeah, it is a fantastic book. It did 2 things. First, when it was coming up, we were like, well, this is a psionics book. No, and it didn't even become the psionics book. It did introduce psychic magic, but Pathfinder's concept of psychic magic is in no way similar to psionics, quote-unquote psionics, that has been attached to the game of D&D for its entire existence. The way the PowerPoints and all that stuff get put together, and these Nova-like, Jean Grey-ish super mental heroes were introduced in the game. The Occult was basically what they say was Penny Dreadful in Pathfinder. This is also where they took this is another example of them just taking the mask off and like, okay, fine, Victorian fantasy is what we're running because that's what drips off of every inch of this book. The Occult classes were creepy, but they were super thematic. You never confused these for sci-fi like psionic powered superheroes. These were people that were divining the spirits and using creepy Ouija boards and dead people's bones and reading the spirits attached to common household objects to see what their personalities were. Every inch of this was just dripping with flavor, and not just the class options that were introduced here, but the whole section of it, where it was starting the adventures line, where it's like, here's how you run a campaign that uses these themes and how to just incorporate these styles of games into your game and shape your adventures to be like this investigation of the creepy and mysterious. That just absolutely made this one of the best books that they've ever produced.
A couple of the classes are probably better integrated into Pathfinder than others. The Kineticist didn't even have to be in Occult Adventures. It could have been in any given hardcover book as a new class. People would have loved it. It's a concept that's very easy to understand. The mechanics are not as difficult if they were laid out better. We've harped on that before. It's just there were some confusing layout choices that were added after this was a demo. It was released as a playtest document, and that Kineticist was easier to understand than the one that got printed, but I think people love the concept enough that they were willing to figure out, like, basically to decipher how this class was written and to find the options are, even though they're not in instinctive places. And then, have you seen many psychics or mediums in your game?
I have seen one psychic, but mostly I see mentalists.
Really?
Mesmerists.
And yes, mesmerist for sure. Is mentalist a thing? It feels like it could have been.
Mm-hmm. No, but
yeah, I've seen mesmerists and I've seen spiritualists.
Mm-hmm. I've seen mesmerists. I've seen a lot of spiritualists. I've seen some occultists. People like playing the occultists, and of course kineticists. But no, the psychic, which you would think would be the star of the show here, I never see them.
I just realized that maybe I need to revisit the spiritualist, because I'm just kind of getting the point with Doreen, my Oracle of Bones in the Hell's Rebels game that I'm playing in. I'm losing some interest in what my mystery. No, not my. Yeah, my mystery. Right, Bones is the mystery. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the Bones options are running out of steam for me, so I wonder if going for spiritualist might be a fun diversion. I'm going to have to see if there's a cool prestige class that is good for multi-classing psychic casters and divine casters. So yeah, as much as I enjoyed Occult Adventures, and I have made some use out of it, mostly the kineticist stuff, I think that might be the next book I dip into for my main character that I'm playing right now.
Now, next up was Bestiary 5. And this is the Bestiary we were like, okay, can they really keep up making these things interesting and fun? And the answer was yeah. We've got to see, oh my gosh, with psychic critters started showing up in this one. We got a lot of clockwork critters. We got a lot of more Asian creatures were brought back for this one. We returned back to the low to mid level range. This wasn't a high level adventure book, though they returned to that in Bestiary 6, which we'll come up to. And it was just a lot of more of what they were doing great was going out to other cultures and bringing their cultural myths back to the game. We also got the Greys, which was creepy, like the concept of our modern gray aliens being a thing that you need to worry about.
Yeah, I still think of Bestiary 5 as the occult bestiary, although I don't think that's fair. It's got a wide variety of creatures. I think what separates it from, once again, Bestiary 2 is that Bestiary 2, the concepts are unfamiliar, whereas the Bestiary 5 concepts are weird, like intentionally weird and creepy and unsettling. So if I just want to confuse or surprise my players, I might go to Bestiary 2, but if I want them to really question what they're fighting, Bestiary 5.
Mm-hmm. Next up was a book that has the wrong name. Ultimate Intrigue. And the reason I say it has the wrong name is that this isn't really an Ultimate book. It really follows the Adventures line in how it presents its entire concept, which is this is about the social mystery. This is about the urban adventuring. This is about all the fun stuff that happens outside the dungeons in the big cities. We get a lot of options for social combat gets visited here. We get the concept of running mysteries and the whole system about where basically you have these the mystery points and you're basically making knowledge checks to do hit point damage to the thing you're trying to discover is a neat concept for how to make that to something more than just, well, let's hope somebody hits the really high DC on the knowledge check and then, oops, nobody did. Well, the GM's going to have to wing it to us anyway, or else the adventure stops right here. A lot of ways for that. And it also introduced the Vigilante as the base class. This is Batman in Pathfinder. There's no way around it. Well, it had various versions of it that let it be other types of masked vigilantes, and I never see them.
No.
I can't think of the last time I've seen a vigilante in play.
I'm gonna maybe if we have time talk about a new Pathfinder Society theme that some of my friends are doing, where we're all making Batman themed characters. Well, not Batman, but like the Batman family and Batman villains. I'm gonna be making a Joker build that I'll talk about in a bit. And Will's playing Batman, and he is not playing a vigilante.
Now, to be fair, if you're building the default vigilante, like the melee specialist sneaky vigilante build, it's not a bad it's not a bad build. You can make decent characters, and the concept of having a social identity that actually has protections. But I almost would have more inclination to use these as villains than I do as the actual as player builds. I don't know why the steam ran out on this in a lot of the local communities, but it did. It's a great options out there. I just don't see them a lot. I know that some of the other bit versions of it, like the caster build version of it, isn't probably statistically the best. But if you're wanting to build, your Batman clone or your melee focused sneaky masked adventurer, it works great. But the rest of the book is great.
So, what I still can't forgive Ultimate Intrigue for is how little I've used it for Hell's Rebels. It should be our go-to book. I know that after Mythic Adventures, Paizo said they're never going to develop a hardcover book to tie into an adventure path that's coming out around the same time. And I believe Hell's Rebels actually came out before Ultimate Intrigue by a year? I think Hell's Rebels was the early 2015 adventure path. But it feels like why aren't I using Ultimate Intrigue options? The feats are really disappointing. The spells I'll have to read over again, but I don't remember them being particularly interesting in an urban setting with the themes that Hell's Rebels has, and I don't understand it. I feel like that should be like, I've got a pile of the books that I use for my character. I feel like that should be on top of that pile. I do appreciate Ultimate Intrigue.
This is almost more an advanced book, and with subsystems, with just a smattering of options. I think the reason you're not using it a lot is that because Hell's Rebel is an adventure path, it was published before it, and because it's an adventure path, all the things that you would come to this book for are already pre-baked into the adventure path. So I don't know that that's the failing of this book so much as the fact that an advice book doesn't help you make adventures for an adventure that's already been made for you.
Well, I do like the subsystems in it. I really like the research rules. It's just, why is Ultimate Intrigue just sitting on my shelf?
I don't know. Next up. Sorry.
I was also transitioning. I was going to say that I do know why Horror Adventures is just sitting on my shelf. This was really a head scratcher when it was announced, because it was announced shortly after Occult Adventures came out. And I never felt like we got a great explanation of why we needed Horror Adventures now. We just got Occult Adventures. We covered a lot of this ground. And I don't think Horror Adventures has the one big thing. Or I guess the corruption mechanic was supposed to be
the corruption mechanic, and like play monster characters was like the big banner on this. And it ended up that the play monster characters options weren't very fun to run, because it very quickly became lose your monster character to random rolls that you can't help very, very quickly. When I review, I guess I got pretty brutal on that. Now the rest of it is fun, great advice book for running creepy games, and the Sandy system's fantastic. A way to add that sort of mechanic if you're wanting to add your Cthulhu or your horror to your games. This is a good book, but a lot of this was thematically a lot of the ground that we already covered in Occult Adventures, even though this is standalone. Occult was about the creepy, and this is about the scary, and those two things have two very differences, even though they thematically will share a lot of space. But you're right that it just got a lot of its wind sucked out of it from the book before it, and the fact that the monster characters just didn't turn out to be easy to run. It kind of stole a lot of its thunder. I guess the most book this gets used for is that this is when they went back and started making a hardcover book that supported an adventure path because, gosh,
The Cthulhu one, the not Cthulhu, but the Lovecraftian one. What is it called? Strange Aeons.
Yeah, Strange Aeons relies heavily on this book for most of it. So I imagine if you're running Strange Aeons, this book comes in real darn handy. But yeah, I mean, it's a great a lot of the same crew that put together Occult Adventures returned for this. And if you want more of that, this is where you go. But it doesn't stand on its own very much.
I also feel like if this book was released 4 years ago, so in 2012, it would have been a very different book. Whereas just the climate has changed, and the idea of like making your characters uncomfortable is successful GMing. Sorry, making your players uncomfortable is successful GMing. That's an old idea now, and that is very much early Pathfinder adventure path design. And Horror Adventures was like just trying to balance a modern sensibility with an older identity for Pathfinder, something that it had grown out of.
The Pocket Edition started showing up here. Nothing really to say about these books other than that they're awesome. It's just these smaller versions of the same books you've been buying, the core rule books, the bestiaries that were cheap, like $25 for the Pocket Edition of the core rulebook and $20 for the bestiary, with similar prices for the similar page counts all throughout the line. And more importantly, they fit in your bag easy because they were smaller. And they were surprisingly durable. I've been using these things for years since they've come out, and they have not started to fall apart on me. I can't say that about a lot of the hardcovers. And so it was a really popular line, and they just announced they're doing even more of these. They're basically going to do the entire line of books available in this format. So if it's a cheaper, smaller, less pretty, because it's, not a big flashy hardcover version of the game that came out. There's not much we can say about the books individually that we haven't already said about the books, but that was a big game changer for the game.
So 2016 hasn't been a great year so far, but then the last book that came out turned it around again. The Villain Codex, surprising.
Oh yeah.
So much fun.
This is the book I had the least expectation for and the most use out of afterwards. You had all of these groups, these generic flavored antagonist groups with lots of stat blocks for their members. This is a codex book, and it lived up to the codex name. So you've got lots of these stat blocks that you could use, and then you had all of these archetypes and feats for villains to use. And these don't really work well for players, but they are so much fun when you add them to villains. And like things that, like, I deal damage to my allies to buff myself is not something you would want to have on your friends, but as one of your villainous leaders, of course they would use an ability that hurts their lackeys in order to buff them up, and that's going to make a fun moment on the field. All the sneaky ways to hide things and to sneak up on your players and double cross and backstab people. You don't want these in the toolbox for your party, but these are great for the villains. And of course the stats themselves were incredibly useful. I went into this not having much expectation other than another monster book, and I came out with so happy. And this is a book I use a lot.
I think I had a similar reaction to its announcement as I had to Horror Adventures, because it felt like Monster Codex was not that old by the time Villain Codex was announced. And I'm surprised, just like, I love both of those books for very different reasons. No, you know what? For a mix of similar reasons and different reasons. The Villain Codex really spends a lot more time, because like Monster Codex, it's like, here's a race that they grow up together. It's like a population of this race. Whereas Villain Codex, it's here's like-minded people from all walks of life. So the builds are different, the motivation is different, and you can just have a lot more personality to what this group is. Whereas, like, Orc Tribe, it's an Orc Tribe. It makes sense. I get it. I get what orcs are. But you get to dive into a little more psychology with the Villain Codex.
Now we've got the next few books. I don't know their opinions have changed, because these are all books we've reviewed recently. And the last few big hardcover reviews, these are books from 2017. We've got Bestiary 6, which we reviewed very recently, very highly. This is Return to the High Level Bestiary. This is you got high level characters. Let's give them a challenge worth it. It has Asmodeus on the cover. Also Karen on the cover. It is, and it really lives up to its promise. You've got very great flavored top level. You've got your archdevils. You've got the Wild Hunt in here. You've got Proteans back in here. You've got the Horsemen of the Apocalypse showing up in here. This is a fantastically put together bestiary for your high level players. Now, if you don't have a high level party, this is one to hold off on, but the game really lacks a lot of variety in high level play. So having this around is very valuable to have, because it has probably more high level content than almost the rest of them put together.
Next up, we have the Advanced something. Sorry, there we go. The Adventurer's Guide.
Remember when I said what would happen when Paizo overextended itself? Well, we're back. At least they got the cover right this time. There's a lot of reprinting in here. There was a lot of formatting errors in here. The Adventure Guide was also one of the first books where they were going to blur the lines between the campaign setting and the role-playing game line. So this is Galarian content. This is 18 different factions in Galarian. You've got your Hell Knights, you've got your Red Mantis, you've got your Pathfinder Society. These are all factions that the players can work with. This is actually basically a big hardcover version of a book that came out much earlier in Pathfinder campaign setting called the Faction Guide. And so if you're interested in the power players in Pathfinder, this has got a lot of fluff you'll like. The crunch just was buggy, and it rewrote a lot of content from previous versions and not consistently. And it's got a pretty bad reputation. It's one of the lowest reviewed hardcovers in the entire line. Now, I imagine that it's going to be just like the other hardcovers, important because it's so chock full of players' options. They're going to still keep seeing it again and again. And this has already been one that's had a lot of FAQ time on correcting some of the errors. So I don't know that this one will, because of how recent it is and because of the nature of the industry has changed, I don't know if we'll ever see a reprint for this to get a proper errata reprint version. But this is a book that if you're going to use, it's got great fluff and some of the options you're going to want, or you're going to have to want if you were using the previous versions of it and they've updated it here. But this is one you're going to want to see the FAQs and the errata to make sure that you're using the current correct versions of what's in this book.
I still don't like that it blurred the lines. I still think it would be a stronger book if it was, here's a generic version of this, and by the way, like in the campaign setting line, then point to the Adventurer Guide and saying, like, this particular faction is a lot like this generic faction from the Adventurer's Guide. And I still am baffled that as someone playing in Hell's Rebels, I'm not even allowed to read the chapter on the Silver Ravens, which is the faction I am a member of in Hell's Rebels, because it's written as though that campaign setting is done, or that campaign arc is done, and it spoils the adventure path that I am currently playing in.
And that's contrary to how their philosophy for writing content has been.
Yeah.
Then there was this big hole in October that kind of sucked all reality, and then we move on to Ultimate Wilderness,
which is still a very recent book, so it's hard to say. Like, our opinions, I don't think have changed unless you've played any of the options in it. I haven't had a chance yet. I'm still playing Hell's Rebels primarily, so Ultimate Wilderness options are a while away before I could play them.
I haven't got to use this one because it's a recent book that is basically, remember why I said that it should be called Adventures instead of Ultimate? It's definitely of that style of book. This is a way to play a campaign. This is a way to adventure in the wild and options to support that. It has a lot of cool options. It has this shifter base class, which we gave our opinions of, and it wasn't very high. It's not as bad as a lot of people like to harp on it for being, it's definitely a serviceable class.
Yes.
But
like, as far as like the headline option, it's not as bad as Horror Adventures.
No.
Horror Adventures headline option is almost unusable. The shifter is fine.
Yeah, the shifter is, you can play a shifter, and in fact, you should get what's the archetype we recommended you should always use if you're playing a shifter?
The ooze shifter? There were a couple of good archetypes.
Yeah.
I don't remember which one specifically you love.
Look at the archetypes. There's one that lets you go into a hybrid form. You want to use that to make the shifter. Then the shifter is a good class again. But the other options for all the other classes are great. The archetypes available for the other classes are fantastic. The advice for running adventures in the wilderness is great. As long as you're not buying this to be the shifter book, it's a good purchase. But again, this is a recent book, so our opinions are still fresh from the review on this one.
And our experiences are as well. We have barely touched it as far as practical use.
Yeah, like this is a book that's going to have to wait for me to start running campaigns and adventures that aren't already in progress in order to incorporate. Then Planar Adventures is going to come out, and that'll be the next book, and that's it. We're caught up.
Yeah, Planar Adventures, I don't have high expectations for, just because this is not... it just doesn't interest me. I've never been a fan of plane shifting, or... I know there's a whole lore that a lot of people love, and I just never even look at. I prefer things on a little bit more, on the ground level, a little more street level. This is just beyond the scope of what I find interesting.
I'm interested to see if they can pitch this in a new way. They have a habit of... we have a habit of saying this conversation and then being impressed by the book. I'm kind of expecting that from what I've seen.
But I mean, at this time, Param, I'm only neutral to this content at best.
Right. Some of the preview material where they were going to introduce ways to make this accessible to low-level characters, I'm kind of interested in seeing how that sales pitch works. The idea of the planar keys and like just one-way gates that make traveling to these places more accessible, that don't assume that you get high-level plane shift as the starting point before anything fun happens that doesn't happen on the material plane. I'm more hopeful for this book because I don't see this as like a big plane hopping stuff, but as a way to introduce elements of the planes into normal campaigning, such as, this area is just infused with the plane of shadow. So what does that mean when this place is really this really corrupted area near Tarbathon is just linked to the plane of shadow? And like, well, that means that these rules take effect, and this is how undead act in here, and being able to just have some fun options that I can incorporate more subtly into it. And that's not... And I know that this will totally work with if you want to do and we're going to the plane of fire this week, and next week we're going to the plane of glass beads, and but I think that it has some potential, and I just need to see. They've impressed me a lot with these pitches of I have no interest in this, and then oh wait, no, that's the reason I should have been interested in this, so that I can give them the benefit of the doubt on this one.
I like the colors on the sample cover.
The sample cover looks nice. It's expected in June.
Under the impression that's not final art, right?
I've never seen this art before.
Oh, well then.
And it's close enough that this could be final art.
Okay. I'm not saying like it doesn't look good enough to be final art. It's just we've seen this piece for a while, like basically since Planar Adventures was announced, and I'm not used to final art being up that early.
Mm-hmm.
Param, traditionally around this time of year, we try and speculate on what the future hardcovers are going to be and other releases.
Mm-hmm.
I know we didn't really prep for any of that. Is this something you'd be interested in doing? Maybe just briefly for tradition's sake?
Oh my goodness, we should give it a go.
All right,
we should give it a go. Oh my goodness. Well, I really want to get books about underground adventures. I think that is an area space we don't have, like Ultimate Dungeon or Ultimate Caverns, like the Underdark stuff. We still don't have a lot of that. There's some design space there, so I think that's a book we could see very in the future.
Param, I've made this prediction possibly every single year. NPC Codex 2. I think this is the year.
I don't know, man. I've given up hope on the NPC Codex too.
There's so many base classes now. They could easily fill a whole book, even with the content that came out before, or everything but Advanced Class Guide content. That's still, oh, well, okay, everything but Advanced Class Guide and Occult Adventures. We've still got as many classes as there were in the core rulebook, and then some. Let me just confirm that. 6 from the APG. Let's say just 1 from Ultimate Combat, 1 from Ultimate Magic, so we're up to 8. And then skipping ahead to, would we get the Unchained ones? Let's say not, just for the sake of this experiment. Ultimate Intrigue adds a 9th base class, and Ultimate Wilderness adds a 10th. So we have 10 base classes. 11 base classes made up the original core rulebook lineup. Surely that's enough content that they can make they can make NPC Codex 2. And then if you add the Advanced Class Guide classes just to fill out what was the NPC classes and the Prestige classes from NPC Codex 1.
I mean, you're right. There's enough material for it to exist. It's just that if it hasn't existed yet, it's hard to see that they'll finally do it. I mean, it was such an obvious option 4 years ago.
Yeah, but also they're still restructuring from for having now two RPGs, 2 separate RPGs that have separate design teams, and each need a lot of attention from the art departments and the editor departments, like the shared departments. And I think NPC Codex 2 it's definitely easier than doing a new bestiary. I still believe we're getting a new, adversary book this year. It's got to be the year, right?
I mean, maybe we might get a big planar filled adversary book, though.
Oh, but don't we already have a lot of planar monsters? Mm-hmm. No, we might get the planar bestiary. You're right. Mm-hmm. Bestiary 7. Are we ready for a Bestiary 7, Param?
Well, of course we are.
We haven't had back-to-back bestiaries since 2011. Mm-hmm. Since then, it's alternated. Codex, Bestiary, Codex, Bestiary, Codex, Bestiary. It's got to be a Codex year at least.
Maybe. We don't know. We don't know.
All right. As far as my non-adversary book prediction, Ultimate Science?
Ultimate Science?
Yeah, so break that Alchemist down, because, Alchemist is a well-supported class. It has a lot of archetypes, and it's a whole concept that really is kind of like it's only the Alchemist. Like, in the book that the Alchemist was introduced, it's not like there was a whole chapter on alchemy and science and that element. It's really just, this is something only the Alchemist can do, and eventually a couple of other classes. But there's room for science-themed tons of classes that are in the game at this point. And I do truly believe that it should be treated just like Magic and just like Combat, I guess, as like a power source that can be explored and fully fleshed out. I definitely believe there's enough material for a hardcover.
I'm going to pull back to an old prediction that I still think now might really be the time, especially given the APs that we're coming up on. I think that Ultimate War is time it shows up. What it would include is a better version of mass combat, of what running a military campaign would be like, because that's a whole style of campaign that's different from your traditional adventuring campaign. An updated version of naval combat that borrows from Starfinder's starship combat. Things like that would be a great... that's enough material that's obvious that could definitely be gathered into a single book to bring some of the material and lessons that we've learned into a book about war.
I can even see them taking something like the Mythic Adventures concept of tiers as something that's separate from your class and applying that to different military branches. And then, and it's your rank. You rank up through your Navy tier, your Army tier, your Air Force tier. Mm-hmm. I know that we were just saying Mythic Adventures is not a book that I think many people consider one of the better ones, but I do think the concept of a class and then a separate thing that is also leveling up at a different pace but congruent to your class, that could be revisited.
And
also,
Oh, sorry.
Scott Melville in chat says Ultimate Alchemy with a question mark. Scott, did you say that before or after I said Ultimate Science? Like, were you clarifying, or did you also predict that? Because I didn't see that until after I made my prediction.
Now, one that I could see, this is my far off prediction, okay? Is
He says after.
Anachronistic Adventures.
Really?
Or
Like,
something.
sincerely?
Sincerely. We've had a lot of space and pulp and time travel for things of other adventure paths in which they've gone to Earth, and et cetera, et cetera. So I can totally see an anachronistic campaign book that brings in, how do you bring in actual Victorian stuff? How do you bring in actual modern stuff? How would the Wild West appear in Pathfinder? How would the Industrial Revolution affect Absalom? I mean, we could bring in a lot of stuff like that. This is my far off prediction for a wild random book, but I'm going to stick by that one. That would be that's a place we have design space for, that has fantasy that hasn't been fulfilled in the game yet, and would also have room for your alchemy and science. That would also have room for better vehicles. That would have room for probably a unique base class or something. You could have we could finally have a gadgeteer.
All right, so if we are doing the real long shot, I am going to say, let's call this Ultimate Settler. And so it's a lot of, no, that's probably too much like Ultimate Wilderness. I was going to say a lot of frontierman stuff, it's basically Kingmaker, the hardcover.
Mm-hmm. But with farms instead of orcs.
Yeah, that's kind of fun. There's definitely going to be some sheep there.
Well, I mean, with the Stardew Valley and the reviving of the survival sim, there's a lot of interesting things like that.
I was also thinking Vikings is a pretty popular show, and it's got to be something else. No, all right, I don't have another far shot, Param. Okay. All right, I guess just no, nothing. I'm sorry.
I mean, we could go the other direction and just go prehistoric adventures.
Oh, see, now that intrigues me a lot more than Planar Adventures. I don't know why. It's just a big dinosaur is a more interesting monster to me than some crazy fluorescent thing that can, I don't know, teleport whenever you cry. Yeah, I know. That second monster suddenly sounds a lot more interesting than just a big dinosaur. But it's just my preferences, Param.
Well, I think that's a good set of predictions. We are coming up on time. I know we were planning on doing some softcover reviews, but I think we'll need to save those for next time. And because we've had, this feature has been fun. It's been a good long trek down our evolving views of the breadth of the Pathfinder game. But I think we need to move on to wrap-ups and shout-outs.
Well, I'm just going to give a brief shout-out first to Scott Melville's suggestion, the T-Rex. He took both of my monsters and smushed them together.
Go, Scott! Oh,
then
Bard's got a perfect
comedy
one.
Adventures.
Yes!
Comedy adventures. That is interesting. Oh, I like that. I love the potential there.
Bard, you are a bard. No longer a wannabe.
Yeah, wow, that is a book I want to exist.
Yes. I still want the almanac to exist too, but I think the odds of that existing keep dropping the further along we go.
Well, you, me, and James Jacobs want it. And it sounded, I believe chat was pretty on board when he's brought it up.
And did you all do good on the forum campaign to make that a reality? I hope so.
Was I supposed to launch that? I didn't do anything.
The community was supposed to launch that.
Oh, okay. That's on you, community. All right, we will be right back to wrap things up right after this.
And We're back.
Thank you for joining us for episode 170 of No Direction, the Pathfinder News, Reviews, and Interviews podcast. Before we go, a couple of things we want to draw your attention to. I actually have listened to a lot of interesting podcasts lately, and so I think it's been a long time since I've directed people to podcasts that I'm listening to. So it's about time that I do this again, Param. First of all, the Board Game Business Podcast. Now, this might be way more of my interests than the average listener. I love getting behind the business side of hobbies that I'm in, and right now I'm in the board game business. So the Board Game Business Podcast covers a lot of topics intelligently. It's well researched, presents the ideas well. But the latest episode was more of an interview. It was called Trapped in an Escape Room. And the reason I'm shouting out to that specific episode, not just because I am a big fan of escape rooms, but at one point they talk about what makes a good puzzle. And that's something that GMs can learn something from. Especially one of the takeaways was don't make a puzzle harder, make it more clever. That there's certain puzzles when you're completed them, sometimes you'll just get more frustrated when you find the answer because it almost felt like trial and error. And there's others, like the good puzzles are the ones where you solve them and you're like, oh yes, like you are excited not just for having solved the puzzle, but you appreciate the puzzle that you just defeated.
Now that's an art form though. That's not something that you can just like dial up the ingredients. You can't just mix 3-part Cheerios, 4 parts ancient medieval history, and 2 parts Bon Iver quotes, and then equal a clever puzzle. That's
true. Well then, Param, maybe you'll just want to buy something, because it's a couple of game designers that have been designing escape rooms in a box. So escape room as a board game. It's almost like a combination of escape room and An Evening of Murder. If you remember those, I think they might still exist. So it's a box full of elements, and you can just kind of reverse engineer them and use them in your role-playing game.
Okay, excellent. I'm always fond of stealing liberally from other sources to make my games better.
Next up, we have writing excuses. I've shouted out to writing excuses before, normally when Paizo was on it, because writing excuses is by authors in the fantasy and sci-fi genre. It's got Brandon Sanderson, for example. So in episode 12.42, the topic is adapting your stories for gameplay. So right off the bat, you can see if you are the kind of GM that has more of a, let's say, more of a novelist style, and it's like you're just trying to find ways to take your ideas that you think are really cool and make sure that you are giving agency to other people that are interacting with your story. It covers that. But I also want to point out, like, my favorite anecdote from this was something from the Schlock Mercenary role-playing game. So Schlock Mercenary is a webcomic. It's almost like if Starfleet was like 99% red shirts. So there's a high mortality rate in the comic. And to represent this in the RPG, they have a rule where instead of taking damage, you can choose to have a red shirt take the shot for you. But before you resolve that attack, you have to write down that character's name, dreams, and 3 interesting facts about them. You write it down on a card, you hand it to the GM. The GM does the resolution, which is literally a coin toss. It is a 50-50 chance this character dies. And if this character that you just crafted dies, GM rips up that card right in front of you. So the long of it is that think of situations like that where if you want to have an emotional impact, just find the tiniest ways to give a little bit more personality to the characters that are going to die. Don't just have a room full of characters getting mowed down. You can have one character whose name the PCs know, and maybe they just, you know, he has a clubbed hand and he couldn't tie his shoelaces one day, and the PCs just tied his shoelace. Then months later, when that character is in peril, my God, you will see your players are motivated to help that poor man. That they just will remember him. They might not remember his name, but they will remember him as the shoelace guy, and it will matter. And my final shout out is the Tome Show. I'm actually going to be recording a guest appearance on the Tome Show tomorrow. We're going to be talking about RPG accessories. And so even though the Tome Show is a Dungeon & Dragon specific podcast, it's accessories. So some of them won't be Dungeon & Dragon specific. They'll be setting neutral. So check it out. I don't know exactly when it's going to be released. I believe Jeff has like a 2-week turnaround time on his recordings. So I will shout out to it again once it's released. But for now, just in case after the last couple of months you are really hurting for more No Direction content, that's kind of No Direction adjacent content. And of course, Tome Show and No Direction have a long history of working together. And in a lot of ways, No Direction owes its existence to the Tome Show.
I want to, again, shout out our fantastic blog content. If you are only listening to the podcast, you're only getting half of our amazing material. You can also get in touch with us by going to our Discord chat, which I also want to promote and continue to promote because it keeps growing. It keeps making my phone beep like crazy. Guys, keep it up. It's where you can chat with other fans of the show and also members of the community and members of the network just about anytime you want.
And I want to reiterate, today's topic basically came from a conversation from Discord. So if you want to help dictate some of the, well, maybe not dictate, but influence the content of the podcast, the Discord chat is a great place to do it.
Yep. We want to congratulate Luis Loza on his new position at Paizo. He has accepted a position there, and he will remain on the network for his producing some blog content as able. We hope that that works out fantastically. So congratulations to Luis. You did great, sir.
Yeah, congratulations, Luis. I just had to look it up. He's officially a developer, in case people were curious exactly what position he has. We will definitely be finding out more details about what he's working on in the coming months, and it might be 6 to 8 months before we actually see some of the books with him with a staff credit on it. But we will let you know when to look out for those because, you know, the boy did good.
Yeah. And there's also Paizo's growing. They've got some open positions right now posted. So if you're interested in working for Paizo, go check it out. They're looking for some developer for organized play. I forget some of the other positions, but there's a lot of positions open right now if you think you want to work for Paizo. Also, we wish to say goodbye to a member of the network. Anthony has left us. He will no longer be writing behind the screen the blog. Ryan has taken that blog over.
Yes, and tomorrow will be my first blog, and it is all about why you should let your players roll their dice however they want.
However they want. Interesting.
Yes.
I will.
Well, I mean, not
within
cheating,
reason, right? I mean,
right. No cheating.
I'm going to roll it behind my sleeve here, where no one can see, and it's always an 18 or higher.
All right. Well, basically, I've often ranted about how I find it's terrible advice to make people roll attacks and damage at the same time, and this just goes into why I dislike that as advice. Because Anthony's abandoned a soapbox for me, and I am more than happy to hop onto it.
Now, Anthony, we do not wish to say is abandoning us. He has provided us with years and years of great content, has helped us set up a lot of our tech angles, and has been a valuable member of this network. We wish him nothing but the best success.
Absolutely. And we also want to congratulate him on his first child coming up soon.
Yes. Congratulations in advance.
Until next time, I'm Ryan Costello.
And I'm Jefferson J. Thacker, also known as Param.
And if you want to find the path, you need no direction.